As I mentioned, your monosaccharides are not limited to what you have seen so far. So they can also be derivatized. So some additional functional groups added, or switching from this functional group to another functional group. And knowing this, it makes us realize that your carbohydrates are actually exciting as your proteins and your nucleic acids, because they can also form a wide variety of structures. For example, let's take glucose, galactose, and mannose. And instead of a hydroxyl group attached to carbon 2, we have an amine group. So we have glucosamine, galactosamine, and manosamine. Now, this amine group can sometimes be condensed with an acetic acid, and we end up with what is called N-acetyl glucosamine. N-acetyl glucosamine is an important component of your bacterial cell wall. Other derivatives include the derivatization is not just limited to carbon 2. For example, in carbon 6, so remember carbon 6 is the CH2OH. So if we replace that OH with a hydrogen, so we end up with CH3. So we end up, for example, with beta-L fucose, which is part of your complex carbohydrates. And we also have alpha-L rhamnose, which is an important component in plants. Now we can also oxidize your carbon 1. So now we are talking about carbon 1. So if we oxidize carbon 1, we make it a carboxylic acid functional group, then we end up with gluconic acid. So if we oxidize carbon 1 of glucose, so it becomes a C double bond OH, or a carboxyl functional group. It becomes a gluconic acid, or gluconate if the proton is removed. We can also oxidize carbon 6. So in that case, we end up with glucuronic acid. Glucuronic acid. So we can also have galacturonic acid, mannuronic acid if we oxidize carbon 6. And then finally, we have this, it's a bit more complicated derivative. So we have here N-acetylnuraminic acid, which is commonly known as sialic acid. So there are 3 derivatizations performed here. So at carbon 1, we find an additional carboxyl group attached to carbon 1. We see an N-acetyl functional group attached to carbon 4. And at carbon 5, we see here a 3-carbon chain attached to it. So this sialic acid is an important component of your glycoconjugates, your carbohydrates conjugated to proteins, which are part of cellular recognition and cellular adhesion. So you will learn more about these as we go along this lecture.